Hi hobby friends, this week we are painting trees but talking wheels. Minds may or may not be blown and myths may or may not be busted. Yes indeed, depending on your background, everything you think you know about colour wheels might be wrong. And if you don't know anything about colour theory, by the end of this video you might know quite a bit more than a lot of artists. Quick detour to introduce the background stars for this week though. I was recently asked to do 5 Ents for the Middle-earth war game by GW. My client wanted something a bit different to the GW sculpts though, and asked me to kit bash the minis from the Blood Bowl Treeman kit. This is what they looked like after the obligatory sanity check Black Prime and Zenithal, but here's one before any paint to give you an idea of the scope of the mods. Okay, so back to wheels within wheels and the mad world of colour theory. The best place to start with colour theory is indeed with one of these, the colour wheel. But before we've gotten underway, there's a problem. There's a pretty high chance me and you aren't talking about the same wheel. And in some respects, this colour that I'm using to block in the leaves here is the problem. You see, people have been waxing lyrical about colour for a good long time. Way back in the 1500s, some of those colour-considering folk came to the conclusion that you could get more or less any colour you wanted if you had 5 pigments. Black and white to adjust your saturation and brightness, and then red, blue and yellow for mixing up any hue you fancied. This idea supplanted the older idea that went all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who considered red, green, blue and ochre as the core colours, though that seems to have been more based on metaphysical philosophy than practicality. Our Renaissance rethinkers were much more pragmatically minded. Red and blue could get you your purples, red and yellow your oranges, and yellow and blue would give you greens. These secondary colours could also be mixed, but the important thing was, with a handful of pigments, you could get basically everything you needed, which opened the way for colour printing, and for the next 500 years or so, and still today even, forms the core of colour theory for painters and designers. If you've heard people refer to green as the complementary colour for red, this 500-year-old model is why. It is a 500-year-old model though, and unsurprisingly, when the scientific revolution came along, things got shaken up a little. You see, that RBY colour wheel wasn't ever based on some abstract truth about colours. It was a practical solution. Pigments in those days were scarce and pricey. Any systematic approach to keeping costs down for painters and printers was enthusiastically embraced. And the RBY model is a very good one. Amongst traditional natural pigments, the really punchy ones, i.e. the ones that will maintain vibrancy when mixed together, are the reds, the blues and the yellows, and those 3 colours are dissimilar enough that the gamut they give you, the hue space between them, will cover all your needs. But then crazy alchemists like that old Newton chap came along and started to mess things up a little. They started to fiddle not with the pigments, but in a sense with the colours themselves, i.e. light. When you split up full spectrum white light into its constituent parts, what you get is this. Now, I'm not going to get into the colours of the rainbow stuff here, which is another set of arbitrary decisions, frankly, but if you wrap this strip around into a circle, you get this. Let's compare this to our RBY wheel. Instead of having red, yellow and blue equidistant, we now have red, green and blue. Turns out those Greeks were onto something after all. If you're mixing light, this model is way better at predicting what colour you'll end up with. But the pigment story wasn't done yet either. The chemists were making science babies with the printers, and all of a sudden we had a dizzying array of crazily intense pigments to choose from. Out of that crucible came a whole new way of mixing colours for print media, the CMY method, or cyan, magenta, yellow. It's like the old RBY method, but just skewed around a little. And wait, hang on a second, that's just the RGB wheel twisted. And so the worlds of additive mixing, where you mix light and always move towards white, and subtractive mixing, where you mix pigments and always move towards black, turned out to be two sides of the same coin all along. RBY, however, lives on. If you do a cursory Google search for color wheels, probably about half of them will be RBY wheels, and if you ask a designer what the complementary color for yellow is, for example, the chances are they'll say purple, not blue. And that captures nicely the two main functions of a color wheel, and why they're so useful to us as mini colorists. Function 1 is the wheel's ability to help us choose our colors, that is to say, make some color schemes and select things like shadows and highlight tones. Function 2 is the wheel's ability to predict the result of mixing, which helps us with making colors on our palette and when choosing undercoats, glazes, and filters for transparency techniques. So, which is better? RBY or CMY, aka RGB? Well, I started my color journey in lighting, so RGB will always be my go-to wheel. And if you ask me, it's a slightly more rigorous system. RGB/CMY has been embraced by just about every industry concerned with color and forms the basis of the so-called real color wheel that many artists now use instead of the old RBY ones. Does that mean we should cast IBY into the abyss of historical mistakes? Absolutely not. RBY is still a useful tool, it still works. If you mix blue and yellow paints, you still get a color everyone would call green. If you mix red and blue paints, you absolutely get purple, and not something any normal eye would scan as magenta. There's something quite pleasingly natural about the RBY wheel as well, if you ask me. And ultimately, as representational painters, most of the time, that's what we're concerned with, getting things to look natural. Most of our little plastic people and trees may be from worlds fantastical or science fictional, but we still want them to look believable. So maybe that old RBY wheel isn't so bad after all. If you find this kind of pure theory video interesting, by the way, do let me know in the comments. This really is a tiny sliver of an introduction to one part of color theory. If you'd like to hear more, let me and the algorithm know with your likes, comments, and shares. And if you like what's going on here on the channel more generally, consider supporting me over on Patreon. These excellent people do, and it's widely accepted that better humans than they do not exist. There's also a free-for-all Discord channel you can check out at the links below, now with exciting monthly challenges and generally fantastic folk to share your hobby joy with. Alright, it's time to take a look at these tree folk. How did I do? Despite starting off with some pretty unintuitive colors, through the process of layering and selecting the right highlights and shadow tones, I think we've ended up with some pretty convincing tree vibes. So there you have it, color theory has at least two wheels, one of them is probably slightly more correct and the other is older and pretty reliable. But how do we apply all this to make better painting decisions? Well, if you like, we can start talking about that next time.